Welcome back. Thank you for staying with us. Let's get into this now, as a Tshwane University of Technology study is painting a bleak picture when it comes to the country's civil servants' competency, particularly with regards to technology. Now, the report says that while the majority of public servants are familiar with technology, they are unable to use it to improve the state's efficiency. Now, for more on the story, I am joined by one of the compilers of the report, Professor Mashupye Maserumule, who is a professor of public affairs at the University of Technology. Prof, thank you very much for making time for us this evening. And of course, this comes on the back of a highlighted national development plan that had highlighted planning for skills development in the sector and saying that this was indeed inadequate. Take me through what informed the study and, of course, more importantly, what the outcome of the study was.
Thank you so much for hosting us this evening. Let me start by saying that the study was actually commissioned by the PSETA, which is a public service sector education and training authority. It was done under the auspices of the Institute for the Future of Work, which is attached to the Tshwane University of Technology. As you did point out, correctly so, that more than 10 years ago, the National Development Plan indicated that planning for skills development in the public sector was inadequate. And therefore, the study was in many ways an attempt to contribute towards solving this challenge. And indeed, the study was concluded. The findings were quite interesting. Firstly, the study established that technology skills are critically important in terms of optimizing state efficiency. And that conclusion was largely reached on the basis of a comparative analysis, which was done taking some insight from various regions worldwide, including Asia, North America, Europe, and Africa. However, when coming to South Africa, indeed, when we interact with most of those that we actually talk to, they are very much aware of the technologies, particularly these technologies of the fourth industrial revolution. However, not much came forth in terms of trying to establish how this technology could actually be used to optimize state efficiency. That is why we are saying that to be aware of something is good. However, it is not the same as using what you are aware of for your maximum advantage, So those are some of the things that were quite interesting, but also what came out very clear was that as much as technology skills are critically important, human skills are equally important. When we talk about human skills, we are talking about cognitive strategic thinking skills, skills related to complex analysis, particularly in the context of the fact that as the world evolves, we are beginning to be confronted with complex policy questions, largely as a result of demographic shift, largely as a result of climate change, and many other emergencies that are beginning to define our existential reality. So in a nutshell, this is what the study found, underscoring the significance of developing technology skills, but at the same time saying that technology skills are not a panacea to some of the challenges that we are confronted with, because there are some challenges that do not really need technology. All what they need is our humanity in terms of how we go about managing public affairs.
Now, I want to zone in on some of the key findings out of this study, Prof, because you did mention earlier there's a bit of a difference, or big difference rather, between knowing what needs to be done, but also possessing the skills to be able to do it properly. One of the key findings here is a study found that most South African government officials were familiar with the technologies of the fourth industrial revolution, but they're not familiar with how these technologies can be used to improve the efficiency of the state. More concerning, though, is that it does seem that officials in government departments that interact directly with citizens also lacked the technologies and tools that are used to take advantage of the new breakthrough in technology. Let's talk about what the underlying reasons could be for this. What would you put this down to? Why is it that our government officials are not up to speed with technology if you're looking in comparison with counterparts in other parts of the world?
That is largely because of the fact that as a country, we are not really investing much in your digital infrastructure. As a country also, we need to begin to start to ask some serious questions with the source of the pipeline. When I talk about the source of the pipeline, I am actually talking about where these public servants are actually being trained and educated, and that is at our university. The question is, whether as universities, are we doing enough to ensure that before we unleash this future public servant into the market, did we adequately prepare them? In other words, in addition to many things that they might have actually studied in political science, in public administration, do they also have technology skills? But at the same time also, you need to understand that the global dynamics in terms of who is actually more richer and who is not really that much richer. Because in other countries, particularly if you look at the countries that are in the global north, they have invested so much in the technology of the fourth industrial revolution, because they do have the capacity to do that, compared to likely most of the countries that will obviously be in a global south, wherein the little that they have will actually be prioritized in other areas rather than technology. However, having said that, it is critically important that we need to, particularly as countries in the global south, we need to do as much as we can to ensure that we invest so much in technology, and that investment could even be in the form of making sure that we contribute towards enhancing the capacity of the very source of talent pipeline for government, to ensure that when they teach, when they train our public servants, they train them in a way that they will at the same time be fully equipped with the technologies of the fourth industrial revolution. Because whether we like it or not, technology is actually defining the future of the 21st century, and therefore we cannot really afford not to be up to speed with the technology of the fourth industrial revolution.
Prof, does this then go back to the age-old discussion around perhaps moving things forward in terms of how we educate within the country, to move away from solely theoretical and incorporate a bit more of the practical aspects here? So would something like vocational training for those government officials and having training centers that focus solely on technology to make sure they get practical training as opposed to just the theoretical knowledge, how far would this go in addressing some of the concerns that you've raised in the report?
It will go a long way. In fact, it's one of the recommendations that we are making in the report. We are emphasizing integrated approach. In other words, whatever that you are doing, we must always make sure that there is some degree of technology. However, I am quite excited that multinational companies that are in the space of technology are coming forward in terms of collaborating with the university, in terms of collaborating with many other training providers. You know, your Microsoft, for example, not long ago, they did sign a memorandum of understanding with the President of the Republic of South Africa, and I've seen that they are now starting to get closer to the universities. They are now starting to get closer to many other training providers. These are some of the critically important interventions that need to be encouraged so that eventually we can have that type of a model public servant who will be well-rounded in terms of a deeper understanding of the complexity of managing public affairs in the 21st century, armed with technological skills, armed with cognitive skills, armed with many other skills that are actually required to be able to deal with all these issues that I actually talked about earlier on, that poses a complex public policy question to our public servants.
Now, Prof. I understand that your role might be solely in terms of investigating what the challenges are and proposing potential solutions. Let's look at whether or not this is even practical, or whether it is a priority for a country such as South Africa to be spending money on perhaps advancing technological centers. Are we in a position to do that? And I say this knowing very well that we are, well, in a position where there's arguments or rather discussions around budget and where money should be allocated. Can we afford to be allocating more money to something at this stage that seems like somewhat of a pipe dream for a third world country like South Africa?
It must not really be a pipe dream. We must make it a reality. The partnership that we are forging with the private sector is critically important. And I'm glad that when we launched the report, we had the leadership of the administration of the state. Some of your director generals were there, and some of your leaders of your state-owned enterprises were there. They appreciated the report, and already some of them have actually made a commitment that they will also start to play a role in terms of making sure that what can be done as recommended in the report can indeed be done. Because some of the things really do not need a lot of money. All what they need is commitment, is dedication, and also focus. So I'm quite optimistic, particularly with with how the report was actually received by those that indeed we wanted them to receive the report. So to that extent, I am quite happy. But what needs to be emphasized is that as much as we find ourselves as a third world country, as you describe it, we need to not really allow our status to define our fate. We need to do whatever that we can. We need to engage our innovative abilities to ensure that we get all those resources that is needed for us to be able to equip our public servants with these technological skills. That is why also in the report we underscore the significance of continuous professional development, wherein this question of training public servants, particularly in those critical areas of technologies, becomes critically important. So I'm quite optimistic that some of the things that we are actually recommending in the report will indeed be taken forward.
Well, great to hear your optimism and the fact that there is buy-in here. Let's talk about the implementation then. The report is there. Who does it go to? Who's responsible then for making sure that this is implemented? And let's talk timelines. By when should the outcomes of the report be implemented?
The main person, the main institutions who is supposed to ensure that the report get properly processed within a government system will obviously be your your Department of Public Service and Administration. However, I need to emphasize the fact that this report was commissioned by Public Service Sector Education and Training Authority. This is an institution which is assigned with the responsibility of facilitating that the skills that are required by the public service are actually made available for the public service to be properly equipped. So the PSETA will have to interact very closely with the Department of Public Service and Administration in terms of communicating the findings and the recommendations that are made in the report, and also your National School of Government ought to come to the party because it is a state training institution. Those areas that the report indicates that they need urgent attention, it becomes the responsibility of the National School of Government to look into those areas and develop programs that seek to ensure that there is a proper intervention. The question of timelines, that will obviously depend on how they plan around the report itself, on how they put together an implementation plan. Because all what we were supposed to do was just to put together a report, and therefore government will have to put together an implementation plan, clearly defining what will be the timelines, so forth and so on. But what makes me glad is that in the launch of the report, a buy-in was clearly demonstrated, and I can only hope that that buy-in will translate into a clear commitments in terms of when to implement what in their implementation plan.
Well, Prof, thank you very much for your time. I wish you all the best as you continue forward then out of the outcomes from that report. That is Professor Mashupye Maserumule, who's a Professor of Public Affairs at the Tshwane University of Technology.